The hall is cold before sunrise, not the comfortable chill of a modern morning, the kind you solve by pulling a blanket closer or turning up a thermostat. This is the cold of stone floors and unheated corridors, of air that has sat still all night in a room sealed against the dark. It is the winter of 1350 somewhere in England, and the woman standing at the center of this room is already dressed, already composed, already performing the role that was assigned to her before she could form her first coherent thought. Most people, when they picture a medieval queen, imagine something close to a painting. A figure suspended in gold and crimson, luminous and untouched, holding a scepter the way a statue holds whatever it was carved to hold. Still, symbolic, decorative. But what did she actually smell like? What was the weight of those garments she wore? What happened to a dress worth more than an entire village when it was soaked through with sweat and rain and the particular smell of a body that had no access to running water? What did it mean to be clean when soap was a luxury and bathing was considered medically dangerous? The England of 1350 is not the England of any comfortable imagination. It has just survived barely the first passage of the Black Death, which by conservative estimates killed between a third and half of the entire population in the preceding year. Villages stand half empty, fields go untended, and yet the court continues. The rituals of queenship continue. The dresses are worn and the ceremonies observed, because the performance of royalty is precisely what holds the remaining world together. This is what those garments actually were, what they meant, and what wearing them really cost. A medieval queen's wardrobe in 14th century England was not a collection of clothes in any modern sense of the phrase. It was a treasury. It was a diplomatic instrument. It was, in the most literal possible meaning of the word, her power made visible. Fabric in this period was among the most expensive commodities in Europe, and the gap between what a queen wore and what even a wealthy merchant's wife could afford was not merely aesthetic but structural, a material expression of a hierarchy that was understood to be ordained by God and enforced by law. Sumptuary legislation in England restricted the wearing of certain fabrics and colours by social rank, which means that the crimson velvet and cloth of gold and ermine trim that appeared on a queen's body were legally inaccessible to anyone below her station. The dress was not decoration. The dress was a statement of cosmic order. Cloth of gold, which appeared regularly in royal wardrobes of the period, was exactly what its name suggests. Fabric woven with actual gold thread, sometimes silver, sometimes both. A single gown made from cloth of gold could cost the equivalent of what a skilled craftsman might earn over the course of several years. Velvet, which is often imagined as a common luxury of the medieval period, was in fact produced in limited quantities, primarily in Italian cities like Genoa and Venice, and its import to England involved merchant networks spanning half a continent. The rich reds and deep blues that characterized royal dress required dyes extracted from materials so rare and so labor-intensive to process that the price per yard of finished fabric could exceed the annual income of most households in the kingdom. A queen wearing 5 or 6 layers of such garments, which was standard practice, was wearing a fortune that most of her subjects could not have comprehended, and none of it was washed. This is the fact that stops modern minds, and it deserves to be examined with more precision than the initial shock allows. The idea that medieval people simply did not bathe or clean themselves is one of the most persistent and most distorted myths about the period. Medieval people washed. They washed their bodies more regularly than popular imagination suggests, using basins and ewers and communal bathhouses that existed in most English towns of any size throughout the medieval period. What they did not do was submerge fabric in water and scrub it with modern detergent, because doing so to a gown woven with gold thread, dyed with precious pigments and structured with internal supports of linen and bone and wire would have destroyed it within a single washing. The dye would run, the metal thread would corrode, the structure would collapse. A garment worth the price of a manor house could be rendered worthless in an afternoon. The solution that royal and noble households used was not neglect. It was layering, and it was a system so precisely engineered that it operated as a kind of early technology for managing the relationship between a valuable outer garment and a living human body. Directly against her skin, the queen wore a linen chemise, a garment that functioned as the washable layer. Linen was chosen specifically because it was both absorbent and durable enough to survive repeated laundering. The chemise collected sweat, skin oils, and the general biological residue of a human body in motion. Above the chemise came additional layers of less expensive wool or silk, and above those came the outer gown, the piece made from cloth of gold or velvet or embroidered silk that could not be washed. The chemise was changed and laundered regularly, sometimes daily in royal households, while the outer garments were brushed, aired, stored with dried herbs and aromatic substances to manage odor and repel insects, and handled with a care that bordered on the ritualistic. The wardrobe accounts of Edward III, who ruled England from 1327 until 1377, and whose queen Philippa of Hainault was among the most documented royal women of the 14th century, record purchases of linen for undergarments in quantities that confirm this system was operating at scale. Philippa's household employed dedicated laundresses whose sole function was managing the washable layers of her wardrobe, and the accounts show regular expenditure on herbs including rosemary, lavender, and dried flowers used to scent storage chests and discourage the moths and beetles that posed a genuine threat to stored fabric. The language of these accounts is dry and bureaucratic, but what they describe is a sophisticated textile management system developed precisely because the outer garments could not be cleaned in any conventional sense. If you are finding this interesting, subscribe. New stories like this come out every week. The herbs were not merely practical, they carried meaning. Lavender was associated with cleanliness and purity in medieval medical thinking, which drew heavily on ancient Greek humoral theory, filtered through Islamic scholarship and then through the European university tradition. The theory held that the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on maintaining their balance. Strong odors, both pleasant and unpleasant, were believed to have direct effects on this balance, with sweet scents promoting health and corrupted smells causing illness. The miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, was the dominant epidemiological framework of the period, and it gave the management of smell a medical urgency that went well beyond the merely social. When the court physicians recommended that Philippa's chambers be aired and scented after her recovery from illness in 1369, they were not speaking metaphorically. They believed, with genuine conviction, backed by the best medical thinking available to them, that the quality of the air in a room had a direct causal relationship with the health of the person who breathed it. This was the world in which a queen's dress was not just a garment, but a medical environment. The outer layers of heavy fabric trapped warmth and protected the body from drafts, which, in a medical framework where cold was believed to invite illness, had practical importance beyond comfort. The weight of these garments, which could total 15 to 20 pounds for a full formal ensemble, including the headdress and jewelry, was not merely the price of fashion. It was in part the material expression of a health strategy, a way of maintaining the bodily warmth that was understood to be essential to life. A queen underdressed was not merely immodest, she was medically vulnerable. Philippa of Hainault herself is a figure who illustrates with unusual clarity how wrong the image of the passive, ornamental medieval queen really is. She arrived in England in 1328, at approximately 14 years of age, to marry the 17-year-old Edward III, and over the following decades she bore him 15 children, of whom 12 survived infancy, a number that is both a biological fact and a political achievement in a world where royal succession was a matter of dynastic survival. She managed a household of hundreds of people, negotiated directly with foreign dignitaries, interceded on behalf of English merchants and craftsmen before the king, And in 1346, while Edward was campaigning in France in the campaign that would end at the Battle of Crécy, she personally led the defence of northern England against a Scottish invasion at the Battle of Neville's Cross, directing English forces in a military engagement that resulted in the capture of the Scottish King David the Cernac. She did all of this in those garments. She made those decisions wearing 15 pounds of cloth of gold and ermine and whatever the English autumn of 1346 brought down onto the shoulders of an army encamped in the north. The wardrobe accounts that survive from her household, now held in the National Archives in London, record not just fabric purchases, but the names of specific craftsmen, the origin cities of imported goods, and occasionally the reasons for particular expenditures, including gowns made for specific diplomatic occasions, repairs to damaged items, and the periodic replacement of items that had worn beyond recovery. These documents are among the most detailed records of royal material culture in 14th century England, and what they reveal is a household operating with the complexity of a medium-sized modern business, tracking inventory, managing suppliers across multiple countries, and planning expenditure years in advance. The dressmakers and tailors who produced these garments operated at the highest level of craft available in England, and several of them appear repeatedly in royal accounts over decades, suggesting long-term relationships between the crown and specific artisans whose skills were irreplaceable. The construction of a formal royal gown was not a simple process. The outer fabric required careful cutting to align patterns and preserve the visual coherence of the design, since the gold thread patterns woven into cloth of gold would be disrupted by careless cutting in ways that could not be repaired. The internal structure, the linen and padding and shaping that gave the gown its silhouette required separate fitting sessions and adjustments as the Queen's body changed through repeated pregnancies. The sleeves of formal gowns in this period were often separate garments attached by laces or pins at the armhole, which meant they could be changed to create what appeared to be a different dress while preserving the body of the gown, a practical adaptation to the economic reality of the clothing's cost. The headdress, which completed the formal ensemble and which the popular imagination reduces to a conical hat with a veil, was in the 14th century a more varied and carefully calibrated piece than that image suggests. For a queen, the headdress served multiple functions simultaneously. It indicated marital status through conventions that were understood by everyone who saw them. It signaled wealth and rank through its materials, which in Philippa's case included gold wirework, silk veiling, and occasionally jewels mounted on gold frames. It also served a practical structural function in that the weight of the headdress required a certain posture, a certain carriage of the head and neck that produced the upright, composed bearing that we associate with formal portraiture of the period. And that was, in fact, at least partly a consequence of wearing a headdress heavy enough to require muscular effort to balance. A queen held her head in that particular way not merely because it expressed dignity, but because the object on her head demanded it. The jewelry that accompanied these garments is worth understanding in its own right, because in the 14th century, jewelry was not primarily ornamental in the sense we now mean. It was capital. When Edward III needed to finance military campaigns, he pledged royal jewels as collateral to Italian banking houses, principally the Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence, in arrangements that were essentially secured loans with the crown's most visible luxury goods as security. The Queen's jewels, which were recorded in inventories and sometimes bore individual names and histories, moved through these financial transactions as liquid assets. When a brooch or a crown appeared on Philippa's person at a state ceremony, it was simultaneously an aesthetic choice, a political signal, and a piece of financial infrastructure. Its presence on her body told every informed observer not just that she was a queen, but that the crown currently possessed the resources to keep it there, rather than having pledged it to a banker in Bruges or Florence. The management of these assets, tracking which pieces were in the royal collection, which were pledged, which were being repaired by goldsmiths, and which were on loan as diplomatic gifts, was the work of the Queen's chamberlain and wardrobe keeper, offices held by people of considerable administrative skill. The Queen's household was not a domestic operation in any diminished sense. It was a parallel court with its own hierarchy, its own financial systems, its own diplomatic channels, and its own political intelligence network. Ladies-in-waiting were not merely companions. They were the daughters and wives of powerful noble families, and their presence in the Queen's chamber gave her continuous access to the internal politics of the aristocracy in a form that no formal report could replicate. A queen who paid attention, and Philippa, by all evidence, paid extraordinarily close attention, knew things about the state of her husband's kingdom that no chancellor or bishop could tell her. When the Black Death reached England in the summer of 1348, it moved through the country with a speed and completeness that no administrative preparation could have anticipated. The mortality in some areas of England approached 60% of the local population within months. Philippa's own household was not immune. Her lady-in-waiting, Joan of Kent, was sent to France for her forthcoming marriage to the son of the King of Castile in 1348 and died there of plague before the wedding could take place. The disruption to the supply chains that kept the royal household functioning in the material sense, the wool merchants, the dye importers, the Italian fabric traders, the regional food suppliers, was enormous. The wardrobe accounts from 1349 and 1350 show both the continuation of royal expenditure on clothing and significant gaps where regular suppliers had ceased to function. What is striking, reading across the administrative records of the period, is the degree to which the formal life of the court continued operating according to its established patterns even in the middle of catastrophe. The ceremonies were observed, the appropriate garments were worn on the appropriate occasions. This was not denial or obliviousness, it was a deliberate and politically rational choice. The performance of royal normalcy in a kingdom where half the population had died was itself a form of governance, a signal that the structures of authority had survived, that the order of the world remained legible, that the rituals which gave social life its coherence had not been broken. Philippa, appearing correctly dressed at court ceremony in the winter of 1350, was making a political argument with her body and her clothes, insisting through the medium of cloth of gold and ermine that the kingdom was still a kingdom. The women who served in her chamber made their own calculations within this framework. A position as lady-in-waiting to the Queen was among the most desirable appointments available to a young woman of noble birth in medieval England, not primarily because of the comfort or the glamour, but because of the proximity to power and the marriage prospects it created. The Queen personally negotiated many of these marriages, acting as a kind of informal placement agent for the daughters of families who had placed their girls in her service. A woman who distinguished herself in the Queen's chamber through intelligence, discretion, and political loyalty could expect to be rewarded with a match to a man of appropriate rank, arranged with the Queen's direct involvement. This gave the Queen leverage over the noble families whose daughters served her, and it gave those daughters an incentive to serve with real commitment rather than merely marking time. The practical training these women received in the Queen's household was substantial. They learned to manage complex domestic operations, to participate in diplomatic conversations, to read the shifting alliances of court politics, and to perform public roles with the precision and control that royal ceremonial demanded. They learned needlework at a level far beyond decoration, since embroidery on royal garments was a skilled craft that produced objects of genuine monetary value and diplomatic significance. Embroidered gifts from a Queen's household to foreign dignitaries were a regular feature of medieval diplomacy, and the women who produced them were contributing directly to the kingdom's foreign relations. The popular image of medieval noble women sitting in towers doing embroidery to pass the time inverts the actual function of the activity almost entirely. The embroidery was not how they occupied themselves while waiting for something important to happen. It was part of what was important. The question of what a queen smelled like in this world is not frivolous, and it is worth returning to it with some precision. The outer garments could not be washed, but they were actively managed. Regular brushing with stiff bristle brushes removed surface dirt and loose fibers. Airing in clean outdoor air, weather permitting, was a standard practice recorded in household accounts. The herbs stored in and around fabric chests, lavender, rosemary, dried wormwood, cedar shavings, and occasionally dried citrus peel, were chosen for documented effectiveness against insect damage, as well as for their aromatic properties. Perfumed waters made from rosewater, orange flower water, and various herbal distillations were applied directly to the face and hands, and sometimes to fabric that could tolerate light moisture without structural damage. The overall effect was almost certainly not unpleasant in the way that modern imagination sometimes projects onto the medieval past. It was different, built from a different palette of scents and managed according to different priorities, but it was managed deliberately and with considerable sophistication. There is something worth sitting with in the full picture that emerges from these records, not as a curiosity about medieval hygiene, but as a more fundamental observation about the nature of power and performance. Philippa of Hainault spent approximately 40 years as Queen of England. She survived the Black Death that killed half her kingdom. She bore 15 children while simultaneously managing a household that functioned as a parallel government, maintaining diplomatic relationships, intervening in military events, and preserving the financial assets of the crown through economic crises that bankrupted the Italian banking houses that had financed English wars. She did all of this within a framework of performance so total that her garments, her posture, the scent of her chambers, and the cut of her headdress were all simultaneously personal and political, all simultaneously her life and her function. The dress that could not be washed was not a symbol of medieval backwardness. It was a piece of political infrastructure maintained by a sophisticated system that we have misread as simple neglect because we have not been paying careful enough attention. The women who wore these garments and managed these systems were not waiting for the modern world to arrive and rescue them from their circumstances. They were doing the most consequential work available to them in their time, with the tools and the knowledge their time provided, and doing it with a competence and a strategic intelligence that the historical record, when read without condescension, makes genuinely visible. The gold thread has long since corroded. The dyes have faded beyond recovery. But the administrative records survive, column after column of careful accounting, and what they document is not absence but presence, the full, complex, irreducibly human presence of women who understood exactly what they were doing and why it mattered.